Michael paid for silence, a ghost town where he could finally bury his past. When he and his only companion, Rocky, arrived, the silence seemed perfect. But Rocky sensed what Michael could not: a life that had no business existing among the ruins. A low growl and a fixed stare at a darkened window was all the warning he got. The veteran came here to escape his own war, but he was about to discover a secret that would force him to fight all over again. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. Where are you listening to this story from? The old Ford pickup groaned as it rolled to a stop, the sound of its tired engine echoing unnaturally in the profound silence. Dust, fine as powdered bone, settled in a lazy cloud around the worn tires. Michael shifted the truck into park and killed the engine. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, a heavy blanket that seemed to smother the world. This, he thought, was the reason he had come. This was the peace he had paid for. Michael was a man molded by noise and chaos, a former Marine whose early 40s were etched onto his face more deeply than his years suggested. His tall frame was lean but solid, carrying a quiet strength that hinted at a life of discipline. Short brown hair, neatly cut, was surrendering to distinguished threads of silver at his temples. His face was a landscape of harsh lines and sun-weathered skin, but his eyes, a deep shade of gray, held a weary kindness that contradicted the rest of him. Dressed in his usual uniform of a plaid flannel shirt over a plain t-shirt, faded denim jeans, and scuffed work boots, he looked like a man who belonged to the rugged Montana landscape that stretched out around him. He had bought the whole town, or what was left of it, sight unseen for a price that was more of an insult than a bargain. Blackwood Creek, a ghost town in the heart of Gallatin County, a place where memories went to die. It was perfect. Here, there were no sudden shouts to make him flinch, no backfiring cars to send his heart racing. There was only the wind, the mountains, and the ghosts of people long gone, ghosts he could live with. A wet nose nudged his hand on the gear shift. Michael looked down at his co-pilot, his only constant. Rocky, a 5-year-old German shepherd, sat patiently in the passenger seat. His magnificent coat was a rare mix of silver gray and white, making him look almost ethereal in the pale afternoon light. Rocky was more than a dog. He was an anchor. His intelligent amber eyes watched Michael now, sensing the tension that always coiled in his human shoulders. With a soft whine, the dog rested his heavy head on Michael's lap, a silent offering of comfort. "We're home, boy," Michael murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He ran a hand over Rocky's head, the thick fur a familiar, grounding texture. He stepped out of the truck, the crunch of his boots on the gravel of the main street, the only sound. The town was a collection of skeletal buildings, their wooden bones bleached gray by decades of sun and snow. The saloon sign dangled from a single rusty hinge, and the windows of the other structures were dark, hollow eyes staring into nothing. Weeds grew thick and defiant through cracks in the boardwalks. It was exactly as he had pictured it, a perfect, empty graveyard of forgotten dreams. This was a place where a man could truly disappear. But as Michael took a slow, deliberate breath of the clean mountain air, Rocky suddenly stiffened beside him. The dog's ears, large and alert, swiveled towards the largest building at the end of the street, the former general store. A low, almost inaudible growl rumbled in his chest. His body went rigid, his gaze fixed. Michael's own senses sharpened instantly, the old training kicking in. He trusted Rocky's instincts more than his own. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, his hand going still on the dog's back. Instead of the deafening silence, Michael began to notice things. The air was not entirely still. A faint, almost imperceptible scent drifted on the breeze, something other than dust and decay. It smelled faintly of wood smoke, and there, on the grimy window of the general store, one pane seemed slightly cleaner than the others, as if it had been wiped recently. Rocky took a tentative step forward, then another, his paws silent on the dusty ground. He wasn't barking aggressively, but with a low, questioning woof, a sound that said, "Someone is here." He looked back at Michael, his eyes asking for permission, or perhaps giving a warning. Michael's hope for a quiet sanctuary began to crumble, replaced by a familiar, unwelcome surge of adrenaline. He followed the dog, his steps now measured and cautious. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, his body remembering drills from a lifetime ago. They crept along the dilapidated boardwalk, the wood groaning under his weight. As they neared the general store, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Rocky stopped at the foot of the porch steps, letting out another soft bark. The front door, weathered and gray, remained shut. Michael put a hand on Rocky's collar, signaling for him to stay. He listened, straining to hear anything over the pounding of his own heart. For a long moment, there was nothing. Perhaps it was just a squatter, he thought. Someone passing through. A problem that could be solved easily enough. Then he heard it. A small, dry cough from within. It was faint, weak, but undeniably human. Before he could process the sound, the sharp, metallic click-clack of a shotgun being cocked echoed from inside the store. The sound cut through the air, and for a split second, Michael was no longer in Montana. He was back in the dust, and the noise, the memory hitting him like a physical blow. The front door creaked open just enough for the twin barrels of an old shotgun to poke through, followed by the person holding it. She was an elderly woman, perhaps in her late 60s, with a face as weathered as the town itself. Her silver hair was tied back in a simple knot, and her eyes, though clouded with anxiety, held a fierce, unbreakable resolve. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the shotgun, its barrels aimed squarely at Michael's chest. "That's far enough," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "This is private property. State your business and be on your way." Michael stood his ground, his posture relaxed but ready. The twin barrels of the shotgun were an unwavering, dark punctuation mark against the weathered wood of the door. He slowly raised his hands, keeping them open and away from his body. It was a gesture of peace, a signal he had used 100 times in places far more dangerous than this. "I mean you no harm," he said, his voice calm and even. Beside him, Rocky did not growl or bark. The dog simply sat, a silent, powerful presence at Michael's side. He watched the woman with an intelligent gaze, his body a study in disciplined stillness. The dog's composure seemed to do more to ease the tension than Michael's words. The woman's eyes flickered from Michael to the dog and back again. The iron resolve in her face was warring with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "This is our home," she stated, though her voice wavered slightly. "I understand," Michael replied. "But I just bought this town. The deed is in my truck. Every building. All of it." The words hung in the air between them. The shotgun didn't lower, but the certainty behind it seemed to falter. The fight drained out of her shoulders, leaving her looking smaller, more fragile. After a long, heavy silence, she finally lowered the weapon. "My name is Eleanor," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She opened the door wider. "You should come inside." And Michael gave Rocky a quiet command to stay, and the dog lay down obediently on the porch, his eyes never leaving the doorway. Michael stepped into the dim interior of the general store. The air inside was cool and smelled of dust, dried herbs, and something savory, like stew. It was clear this was not just a shelter, but a home, forged from necessity. Blankets were hung from ropes to create separate rooms. Wooden crates served as tables and chairs. The shelves, once stocked with goods for a thriving town, now held a meager collection of canned food, jars of preserved vegetables, and neatly folded clothes. It was sparse, but it was immaculately clean. Eleanor gestured for him to sit on an overturned crate. She leaned the shotgun against a wall and sank onto another crate, her hands trembling in her lap. "My husband, Thomas, he built his life here," she began, her gaze distant, fixed on a past only she could see. "We had a small ranch just a few miles east of here. It wasn't much, but it was ours. He passed away last winter. The flu took him fast." She paused, swallowing hard against a wave of grief. After the funeral, the bank came calling. Clearwater Valley Bank. They said Thomas had taken out a large loan against the ranch for new equipment, improvements he never made. They showed me papers with his signature on them. She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Thomas was a proud man. He hated debt more than anything, and his signature, it never looked like that. Her story tumbled out, a torrent of injustice and heartbreak. She explained how she tried to fight it, how the bank officials were polite but unmovable. As a widow, she had no legal standing to contest her husband's supposed debts. They took everything: the land, the house, the horses. They left her and her granddaughter with nothing. We had nowhere else to go, Eleanor finished, her voice thick with unshed tears. I remembered this place from when I was a girl. I knew it was empty. We walked here. It was the only shelter for 100 miles. As if on cue, a sound came from behind one of the blanket partitions. It was a cough, a terrible, wet sound that rattled deep in the chest. It was weak, yet violent, ending in a breathless gasp for air. Instantly, all the hardness in Eleanor's face dissolved into pure, unadulterated fear. "Lily?" she breathed, rushing towards the makeshift bedroom. Michael stood up, his gaze drawn to the movement. Through a gap in the blankets, he caught his first glimpse of the granddaughter. A small girl, surely no older than 8 or 9, was propped up on a bed made of stacked pallets and old quilts. Her name was Lily. She was terrifyingly thin, her skin pale and translucent, stretched taut over delicate bones. Dark circles, like bruises, shadowed her eyes, which seemed too large for her small face. A sheen of sweat glistened on her forehead. When she saw Michael, her fever-bright eyes widened, not with curiosity, but with a deep, weary fear. The sight of her, so fragile and sick, struck Michael with the force of a physical blow. He had seen death and suffering in many forms, but the quiet, helpless suffering of a child was something he could never stomach. The walls he had so carefully built around his heart to keep the world out, to keep his memories locked away, suddenly felt paper-thin. He saw the girl's silent struggle, her fight for every breath, and he saw the absolute desperation in Eleanor's eyes as she gently wiped the girl's face with a damp cloth. This was the unspoken plea. It wasn't a request for a handout. It was a silent, desperate cry for a safe place to heal. His own quest for silence and solitude suddenly felt profoundly selfish. Without a word, Michael turned and walked out of the store. He heard Eleanor draw a sharp breath behind him, a sound of renewed fear, thinking he was leaving or perhaps going to force them out. He ignored it, his mind set. He strode back to his truck, Rocky rising to meet him with a questioning look. Michael opened the passenger side door and pulled out a large cardboard box from the footwell. It contained his own supplies: canned beans, salted meat, coffee, and bags of rice. He also grabbed 2 heavy wool blankets and his largest canteen, which he had filled with fresh water that morning. He walked back to the porch and set the box down in front of the open door. He didn't say, "You can stay." He didn't say anything at all. He just placed the items on the dusty wood, a simple offering. Rocky padded up the steps and gently nudged the box with his nose, then looked up at Eleanor, who stood frozen in the doorway, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning hope. An agreement had been made, not with words, but with a box of food and an act of quiet compassion. Michael and Rocky had arrived seeking an empty town. Instead, they had found a duty, and for the first time in a long time, the silence Michael sought felt a little less empty. A fragile peace settled over Blackwood Creek for a day. Michael worked, his hands finding a steady rhythm in the simple, honest labor of securing a loose board on the general store's porch. He wasn't a carpenter, but he was methodical. Eleanor, moving with a quiet gratitude, had insisted on making him a thin but hot stew, which they had eaten in a shared, comfortable silence. Lily remained out of sight, her presence felt only through the muffled sounds of her coughing, which seemed to Michael's hopeful ear, a little less severe than the day before. Rocky was a constant, silent shadow, moving between Michael and the porch, a self-appointed guardian of their small, unlikely truce. The peace was shattered by the distant drone of an engine. Rocky's head shot up, his ears swiveling to pinpoint the source. He let out a low rumble, not of aggression, but of warning. Michael set his hammer down, his body tensing. He straightened up and watched the single dirt road leading into town. A moment later, a county sheriff's vehicle appeared, kicking up a plume of brown dust that tainted the clear Montana sky. It came to a hard stop in front of the store, its engine idling with an arrogant grumble. The driver's door opened and a large man squeezed himself out. This had to be Sheriff Brody. He was in his 50s, with a fleshy, florid face that suggested a fondness for whiskey and easy living. His uniform was stretched taut across a prominent belly, and a permanent, condescending smirk was plastered on his face. He moved with the slow, deliberate swagger of a man who had never been questioned. 2 deputies got out after him. One was a young man with nervous eyes and a uniform that still looked new. He fidgeted with his belt and avoided making eye contact. The other was older, leaner, with a cynical glint in his eye and a posture that spoke of a man who enjoyed his authority. Brody ignored Michael completely, his small, calculating eyes landing on Eleanor, who had appeared in the doorway, her face pale with dread. "Eleanor," Brody said, his voice oozing false pleasantry. "I was hoping I'd find you here. Saved me a long ride out to your old property." "Oh, wait." He tapped his chin in mock thought. "That's not your property anymore, is it?" The younger deputy shifted his feet, looking uncomfortable. The older one just smirked. "What do you want, Brody?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight. "Just following up on some official business," the sheriff said, pulling a folded sheaf of papers from his shirt pocket. He unfolded them with a theatrical flourish. "According to my friends down at Clearwater Valley Bank, you still have an outstanding debt, $800, plus fees. Since you have no assets to seize, the bank has filed a complaint, trespassing, vagrancy. I'm here to escort you and the child off this property." He said "child" with a particular distaste, as if her very existence was an inconvenience. The papers were a clear pretext, a flimsy excuse wrapped in legal language. Michael remained silent, leaning against a porch column, watching, listening. He let Brody play his hand. "This is my home now," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but defiant. Brody laughed, a short, ugly sound. "This is a ghost town, sweetheart. It's nobody's home." He nodded to his older deputy. "Collins, be a gentleman and help the lady with her things." Deputy Collins started towards the porch, his hand resting casually on his holstered sidearm. He took 1 step, then 2. He never made it to the 3rd. In a blur of gray and white fur, Rocky moved. He didn't charge, he didn't bark wildly. It was something far more terrifying. He launched himself from his resting spot and landed silently between Collins and Eleanor, planting his feet foursquare on the ground. His head was low, his hackles were raised, and a growl, deep and resonant as the earth itself, vibrated from his chest. His lips peeled back just enough to reveal a formidable set of white teeth. He didn't lunge. He simply stood, an immovable wall of protective fury, his amber eyes locked on the deputy with lethal intensity. Collins froze mid-stride, his hand hovering over his gun, his face suddenly pale. The young deputy took an involuntary step backward. Sheriff Brody's smug expression vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine anger and perhaps a flicker of fear. His attention was finally, forcefully, drawn to the silent man on the porch. "Call off your dog," he snapped at Michael. Michael pushed himself off the column, his movements unhurried. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "He's not bothering anyone," Michael said, his voice flat and cold. "He's on my property. You, however, are harassing a guest of mine." "Your property?" Brody scoffed, though his eyes kept darting nervously towards Rocky, who hadn't moved a muscle. "I have the deed. Filed with the county yesterday," Michael said. This town, this store, this very patch of dirt you're standing on, belongs to me, and I'm telling you to leave her alone." The sheriff was trapped. His authority was being openly challenged. The combination of a growling German shepherd who looked ready to tear out a throat and a man who stood with the unshakable stillness of a mountain was something his usual bullying tactics couldn't overcome. Michael wasn't afraid of him, and that was a problem Brody didn't know how to solve. For a long moment, the only sound was Rocky's menacing growl. Finally, Brody's face hardened into a mask of official outrage. He knew he had lost this confrontation. He pointed a thick finger at Michael. "You're making a big mistake, friend. Harboring a debtor, obstructing a law officer in his duties. I'll be back. And when I return, I'll have a warrant for her arrest, and one for yours too." He turned on his heel and stomped back to his vehicle, his deputies following quickly. The older one, Collins, cast one last hateful glare at Rocky before slamming his door. The car roared to life, spun around in a spray of gravel, and sped away, leaving only a cloud of dust and a lingering threat hanging in the air. Michael finally let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He placed a hand on Rocky's head. The dog's growl subsided instantly, and he leaned into Michael's touch, his body relaxing. The immediate danger was gone, but the shadow of the law now loomed darker than ever over their fragile sanctuary. The dust kicked up by Sheriff Brody's vehicle settled slowly, coating everything in a fresh layer of grime. The silence that returned was different now, heavier and more menacing than before. The illusion of a peaceful sanctuary had been shattered. Michael stood on the porch, his hand still resting on Rocky's head, the dog's solid presence a grounding force against the sudden turmoil. Eleanor sagged against the doorframe, the shotgun held loosely in her hand, its threat forgotten. The fiery defiance she had shown the sheriff was gone, replaced by a deep, trembling exhaustion. "He'll be back," she whispered, her voice hollow. "He won't let this go." "I know," Michael said. He gestured with his head toward the inside of the store. "Let's go inside." They sat at the makeshift table of wooden crates, a pot of cold stew forgotten between them. Rocky lay at Michael's feet, his body relaxed but his eyes alert, tracking every movement, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Michael was processing the confrontation, analyzing it, breaking it down into tactical components, just as he had been trained to do. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence, her voice regaining some of its earlier strength. "He's lying. The bank, Brody, all of them." She looked Michael directly in the eye, a desperate need for him to believe her shining in their depths. "My Thomas, he was a stubborn man, proud. He mended his own fences, fixed his own tractor, delivered his own calves. He used to say debt was just another kind of chain. He would never, ever have signed a loan like that. Not without telling me. Not for things we didn't even need." She clenched her fists on the crate, her knuckles white. "And that signature, I saw it. It was his name, but it wasn't his hand. It was too neat, too perfect. Thomas's signature was like him, a little crooked, impatient. I'd know it anywhere. B.S." Michael listened intently, nodding slowly. He didn't doubt her for a second. What he had seen in Sheriff Brody was not a man upholding the law, but a predator cornering his prey. The pieces were clicking into place in his mind, forming a pattern that was ugly and deeply familiar. He had seen this before. Not in Montana, not with banks and deeds, but in the dusty villages of Afghanistan and the chaotic streets of Iraq. He recognized the strategy. It was a classic insurgency tactic, adapted for a different kind of war. First, you identify a vulnerable target, an isolated village, a family without a strong protector. In this case, a grieving widow, someone perceived as weak and unable to fight back. Next, you create a pretext for attack, a justification, a forged document, a false accusation. You use paperwork and legal threats instead of bullets, but the goal is the same: to destabilize and control. The loan papers were Brody's version of planting false evidence. Finally, you apply pressure, using a corrupt authority figure, a local warlord, a crooked police chief, or a county sheriff who's in the pocket of a predatory bank. Brody's role was to enforce the lie, to make it seem official, to intimidate the target into submission. It was a clean, efficient operation designed to steal land from people who lacked the resources or the knowledge to defend themselves legally. This wasn't just about Eleanor. She was one target in a larger campaign. Michael knew it with a cold certainty that settled deep in his gut. "This isn't just about the $800, he said, more to himself than to her. Eleanor looked at him, surprised by his tone. "What do you mean?" "It's a system," he explained, his voice low and hard. "A well-planned operation. They wait for someone to be at their weakest, like after a death in the family. They create a paper trail that's hard to fight, and they use the law as a weapon to finish the job. They're not just taking your ranch. They're likely doing this to others." The realization dawned on Eleanor's face, a mixture of horror and a strange sort of validation. She wasn't just a victim of bad luck. She was a casualty of a calculated attack. In that moment, something inside Michael shifted permanently. The fragile peace he had sought for himself no longer mattered. His desire to be left alone, to hide from the world and its ugliness, was a luxury he could no longer afford. When he had first seen Lily, frail and sick, his heart had been moved by a deep, protective pity. But now, it was different. Pity was a passive emotion. What he felt now was a cold, clear-eyed rage. This was a mission. The objective was clear: protect the innocent. The enemy was defined: a corrupt system that preyed on the weak. The stakes were absolute. He had spent years trying to forget the man he used to be, the Marine who lived by a code of honor, who ran toward the fight, who never left anyone behind. He thought that man was gone, buried under layers of grief and exhaustion. But looking at Eleanor's determined, fearful face, he realized that man was just dormant. He had just been waiting for a reason to fight. He would not back down. He would not run. This ghost town, which he had bought as a final resting place for his own haunted past, had just become a battlefield. And this was a battle he would not lose. Rocky, sensing the change in his human, lifted his head and rested it gently on Michael's knee, looking up at him with those unwavering amber eyes. The dog didn't know the details, but he knew the intent. He knew his master had found a purpose, and wherever Michael went, whatever fight he picked, Rocky would be right there with him. Number 1. 2 days passed in a state of tense anticipation. The threat of Sheriff Brody's return hung over the ghost town like a gathering storm. Michael spent the time methodically preparing, not for a fight with guns, but for a siege of attrition. He repaired the old well pump, ensuring a steady supply of clean water. He patched a section of the general store's roof, his movements economical and precise. He was a man with a mission again, and the familiar focus pushed the worst of his own ghosts back into the shadows. Eleanor, bolstered by his quiet resolve, tended to Lily. The little girl's coughs still echoed from the back of the store, but a fragile strength was returning to her. She was now able to sit up for short periods, watching Michael and Rocky with wide, curious eyes. Rocky, for his part, was a constant, calming presence. He would lie on the porch for hours, a vigilant sentinel, then pad inside to gently nudge Lily's hand with his wet nose, a gesture that always brought a weak smile to her face. It was late in the afternoon on the second day when Rocky's ears perked up. He rose to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his gaze fixed on the dirt road. Michael heard it a moment later, the sound of engines, more than one this time. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had expected Brody, but not a convoy. He moved to the edge of the porch, Rocky at his side, every muscle coiled. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of fear. But as the vehicles came into view, it was clear this was not the law. It was a trio of dusty, dented farm trucks, the kind held together by hard work and stubbornness. They pulled to a stop near Michael's Ford, and their engines died one by one. The doors opened, and people began to climb out. They were families, Tired-looking men in worn jeans and flannel shirts, their faces etched with the same worry Michael saw in Eleanor. Women with weary eyes held the hands of quiet, watchful children. They looked hesitant, uncertain, but not hostile. A woman stepped forward from the lead truck, clearly their leader. She was in her late 40s, with sun-browned skin and strong, capable hands that spoke of a life spent working the land. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her gaze was direct and intelligent. She possessed an air of strength that was not aggressive, but deeply rooted and unshakable. She stopped a respectful distance away, her eyes taking in Michael and the formidable dog at his side. "Are you the man who told Sheriff Brody to get off your land?" she asked, her voice clear and strong. Michael just nodded. "My name is Maria," she said. "We heard what happened. Small towns talk. The story of a stranger and his dog backing down the sheriff, well, that's not something you hear every day." She gestured to the silent group behind her. "We came to thank you, and to tell you, you're not alone in this fight." That evening, as the Montana sky bled into shades of orange and purple, they gathered around a small, carefully built fire in the center of the main street. The air was filled with the low murmur of voices as, one by one, the families shared their stories. Each tale was a heartbreaking echo of Eleanor's, Encold, a husband who died in a farming accident, followed weeks later by the bank presenting a loan for seeds he'd never bought. An elderly father who passed from a heart attack, leaving behind a forged document for a tractor his family never saw. The pattern was undeniable. The target was always someone vulnerable, grieving. The method was always the same: a fraudulent loan, a forged signature, and the swift, brutal enforcement by Sheriff Brody and the Clearwater Valley Bank. They were land thieves, hiding their crimes behind a veneer of legality. Michael listened in silence, his jaw tight with a cold fury. He saw the faces of the children, their childhood stolen by greed. He saw the quiet, desperate dignity of their parents. This was bigger than he had imagined. It was a sickness that had taken root in the heart of the county. When the last story was told, a somber silence fell over the group, broken only by the crackle of the fire. It was Maria who finally spoke, her voice cutting through the despair. "Our stories are true," she said, her gaze sweeping over the faces illuminated by the firelight. "We all know it. But the truth isn't enough, not for men like Brody. To them, we are just noise. Our words are wind. To fight them, we need proof. Something hard, something they can't deny or bury." A wave of hopelessness washed over the small crowd. Where could they possibly find such proof? Maria held up a hand. "There might be a way," she said, her voice lowering. "There was a young man working at the bank, a teller named David." She described him as a local boy, barely in his 20s, who had been so proud to get a respectable job in town. But he was a good person with a strong conscience. He started noticing things: paperwork that didn't add up, signatures that looked too similar. He became withdrawn, tormented by what he was a part of. "He tried to contact me a few weeks ago," Maria continued. "He was scared, terrified they would find out. He said he had proof, that he had copied documents. He wanted to meet, to give them to me. But before we could, he disappeared. His landlord said he packed a bag and left in the middle of the night. No one has seen or heard from him since." In what helped so fray, the flickering flame of hope the group had felt upon gathering now seemed perilously close to being extinguished. Their only potential witness, the one person who could give them the weapon they needed, was gone. "Brody's people probably got to him," one of the men said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Maybe," Maria conceded, though her eyes still held a spark of defiance. "Or maybe he's just hiding, waiting for a sign that it's safe to come forward." She looked directly at Michael. "What we need to do now is find him, or find what he left behind." The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows. A mission had been defined. It was a desperate, almost impossible task, but for the first time, it was a shared one. A fragile community had been forged in the embers of their collective loss, their hope now a single, flickering flame in the vast Montana darkness. The search for David began at dawn. It was a grim, methodical effort, born of desperation. Michael, Maria, and the other families split into small groups, fanning out across the vast, indifferent landscape. They checked abandoned homesteads, remote fishing spots, and anywhere a man might go to disappear. Michael's military experience in tracking and observation was invaluable, but even he could find no clear signs. The hours bled into one another, each empty lead chipping away at their fragile hope. By late afternoon, the groups began to return to Blackwood Creek, their faces etched with the familiar lines of defeat. There was one last place to check: an old trapper's cabin tucked deep in a wooded valley about 5 miles north. It was a place Maria had mentioned with little optimism, a ruin that was more legend than shelter. The others were too exhausted and disheartened to make the trek. "I'll go," Michael said, his voice quiet but firm. "Rocky and I could use the walk." He set off as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, golden fingers of light through the pines. Rocky trotted ahead, his gait light and energetic, seemingly untroubled by the day's failures. For Michael, the quiet of the woods was a welcome reprieve. He moved with a practiced silence, his mind focused on the task, but a cold sense of futility had begun to creep in. David was gone, vanished, like a ghost. They found the cabin nestled in a small clearing. It was in even worse shape than Maria had described. The roof had partially collapsed, and the single door hung crookedly from a leather hinge. It was a place of deep decay, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. Michael felt his hope sink. No one could have hidden here for long. He pushed the door open, the sound of rotting wood groaning in protest. Inside, the cabin was a single, small room. Dust motes danced in the slanted shafts of evening light. The floor was littered with fallen leaves and the debris of animal nests. There were signs that someone had been here recently, a few empty tin cans and the ashes of a small fire, but they could have been from any drifter or hunter. Michael kicked at the ashes. They were cold. He did a slow, careful sweep of the room, checking the corners, looking for anything out of place. He found nothing. He was about to turn and leave when he realized Rocky was not by his side. The dog was standing in the far corner of the cabin, a space shrouded in deep shadow. He was rigid, his body tense, a low whine escaping his throat. "What is it, boy?" Michael said softly. "Just a field mouse." But Rocky didn't relax. He began to bark, not a loud, aggressive sound, but a sharp, insistent command. "Look here!" He pawed at the floorboards, his claws making a scratching sound against the old wood. He then looked directly at Michael, barked again, and resumed scratching with more intensity. Michael walked over, his boots crunching on the debris. He knelt beside his dog, running a hand along his back. "Easy, boy, there's nothing here." He rapped his knuckles on the floorboards. They were old, but they seemed solid enough. Rocky whined, frustrated. He nudged Michael's hand away with his snout and began digging at one specific board with a frantic energy. It was slightly looser than the others, its edges dark with age. The dog would scratch, then look at Michael, a desperate plea in his intelligent eyes. He was not just sensing something, he was communicating. His loyalty, his entire being, was focused on this single task of making his human understand. Trust in his dog was a core principle of Michael's life. He stood up and looked around the cabin. In a corner, half buried in leaves, was a rusted tire iron, likely left over from a vehicle that had died nearby decades ago. He picked it up. It felt heavy and solid in his hand. He returned to the spot and wedged the flattened end of the tire iron into the crack beside the board Rocky had indicated. He put his weight on it. The old wood groaned, resisted, and then with a splintering crack, it gave way. Michael pried the board up and set it aside. Underneath, nestled in the dark, cool earth, was a metal box. It was an old Army surplus ammunition can, rusted at the edges but still solid. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs. He lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. He set it on the floor, and Rocky immediately sniffed at it, his tail giving a single, satisfied thump against the floorboards. With trembling hands, Michael worked the latch. It was stiff, but it finally sprang open with a loud click. He lifted the lid. Inside, protected from the damp by an oilcloth wrap, was a collection of papers. He carefully lifted them out. The top item was a thick, bound ledger. He opened it to a random page. It was a meticulous record of names, dates, and figures, with a second, hidden column detailing the true value of the properties and the fraudulent loan amounts. Beneath the ledger were the contracts, dozens of them. He saw the name Thomas, Eleanor's husband, near the top of the pile. His signature, a neat, precise script that looked nothing like the scrawl of a hard-working farmer. It was the proof. Hard, undeniable, and utterly damning. The last item in the box was a single folded envelope. Michael's name was not on it. It was addressed to whoever might find it. He unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was shaky, the ink slightly blurred in places, as if by tears. If you are reading this, it means I am either dead or have disappeared for good. My name is David, and I cannot live with what I have done. They made me do it. The bank president, the sheriff. They called it reclaiming underperforming assets. I called it stealing from the dead. I forged those papers, all of them. My guilt is more than I can bear. I can't go to the law because the law is part of it. This box contains everything, the real ledgers, all the proof you need to burn them to the ground. Please, use it. Do what I was too cowardly to do. Don't let them get away with it. Don't let it all be for nothing. Michael read the letter twice, a profound sadness settling over him. This was their victory, their key to justice, but it was a victory paid for with a young man's life, or at the very least, his soul. He carefully placed everything back in the box and closed the lid. He stood up, the heavy can in his hand. He looked down at Rocky, who was watching him with a quiet, knowing gaze. He had come to this town seeking nothing but silence. He had found a war. And his dog, with a scent for a justice that went deeper than any human law, had just handed him the weapon to win it. Michael and Rocky returned to Blackwood Creek as twilight began to drape the valley in shades of purple and gray. The heavy metal box in Michael's hand felt like both a lead weight and a lifeline. The small community of displaced families watched their approach, their faces drawn with a day's worth of fruitless searching and anxiety. He didn't make a grand announcement. He simply walked to the center of the gathering, set the box down by the fire pit, and opened the lid. He handed the ledger to Maria and the stack of forged contracts to Eleanor. A reverent silence fell over the small group as they huddled together, passing the papers from hand to hand under the flickering firelight. Gasps of recognition, muttered curses, and the quiet, choked sobs of vindication filled the air. They saw their own names, the names of their deceased husbands and fathers, next to the fraudulent figures. And then Maria read David's letter aloud, her strong voice cracking with emotion. The letter transformed their anger into a somber, steely resolve. They had their proof. The truth, buried in a lonely cabin, had been unearthed. For a fleeting, precious moment, hope burned brightly in the heart of the ghost town. The celebration was cut short by the now familiar glare of headlights piercing the darkness. A single vehicle, moving fast, Sheriff Brody's patrol car. This time, he didn't park at a distance. He drove right into the center of the town and killed the engine, leaving his headlights on, pinning the families in their harsh, interrogating beams. He stepped out of the car, and the smugness from his previous visit had been magnified into an aura of absolute, triumphant confidence. He surveyed the fearful faces caught in the light and smiled. "Well, now, isn't this cozy?" Brody said, his voice booming with false cheer. "A regular little town meeting. Saves me the trouble of rounding you all up individually." "What do you want, Brody?" Maria demanded, stepping in front of the others. Michael moved to stand beside her, the box of evidence now resting at his feet. Rocky was a rigid statue of gray fur next to him, a low growl already building in his chest. "I'm just here to deliver some news," Brody said, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Your little witness? The bank teller David? We found him. Picked him up just outside of Bozeman, trying to hop a freight train." A wave of shock and fear rippled through the crowd. "He was very cooperative," Brody continued, savoring each word. "Cried his eyes out. Sang like a canary, in fact. Told us all about his little crisis of conscience, and then he told us all about you." He pointed a thick finger at Maria. "He told us how you pressured him, filled his head with lies about the bank. And he told us about all of you." His finger swept across the terrified families. "He confessed to conspiring with you to defraud the bank and slander honest, law-abiding citizens. He named every last one of you as co-conspirators in a plot to obstruct justice. The lie was audacious, monstrous, and devastatingly effective. The families, who knew only hardship and the heavy hand of the law, felt the trap spring shut. Their hope, which had soared only moments before, plummeted into a black abyss of despair. The word conspirators hung in the air, a legal death sentence. "You're lying," Michael said, his voice a low, dangerous counterpoint to the rising panic. "Am I?" Brody sneered. "His signed confession is already on its way to the district attorney. You people aren't victims anymore. You're criminals, and you're all going to prison." That was the breaking point. The fragile unity of the group shattered. A woman began to sob uncontrollably. One of the men shouted at Maria, accusing her of leading them into a trap. Panic and accusations flew through the cold night air. The flickering flame of hope had been brutally stomped out, replaced by the bitter smoke of betrayal and terror. And then, a sound cut through the chaos, a sound more terrible than any lie Brody could tell. It was a scream. It was Eleanor. "Lily! Oh God, Lily!" Everyone turned. The back of the general store was suddenly illuminated by the warm, frantic light of a kerosene lamp. Michael was the first one to move, pushing through the panicked crowd and vaulting onto the porch. He burst into the store to find a scene of pure terror. Lily was on her makeshift bed, her small body rigid and convulsing. Her eyes had rolled back in her head, and a feverish heat radiated from her skin. Eleanor was kneeling beside her, trying to hold her, her face a mask of primal fear. "She's burning up! She won't wake up!" Eleanor cried, her voice raw with hysteria. The little girl's seizure was violent, a storm raging through her fragile body. The chaos from outside flooded into the small, warm space. People crowded into the doorway, their own fear momentarily forgotten in the face of this immediate life-or-death crisis. Amid the pandemonium, Michael's mind went quiet and clear. The training took over. He saw two fronts in this war, the legal battle and the battle for a child's life. He couldn't fight both at once. He scanned the crowd, and his eyes locked on Maria, who had followed him inside, her face pale, but her expression still resolute. He grabbed the heavy metal box from the floor where he'd left it. He shoved it into her hands. It was so heavy, she nearly dropped it. "Maria," he said, his voice cutting through the noise with absolute authority. "Forget Brody. Forget all of this. You know that federal investigator you trust? The one you mentioned?" She stared at him, confused, then nodded. "Williams, in Helena. Go. Now," Michael commanded, his eyes boring into hers. "Take your truck. Don't stop for anything or anyone. Get this box to Williams. It's our only chance. Go." For a second she hesitated, torn between the fight here and the mission he had just given her. Then, seeing the grim certainty on his face and hearing the terrible, choked gasps coming from Lily, she understood. She clutched the box to her chest, gave a single, sharp nod, and turned, pushing her way back through the crowd, her new purpose clear. Michael turned his full attention back to the dying child on the bed, the vicious gambit outside momentarily forgotten. The only thing that mattered now was the small, flickering life, threatening to be extinguished in the dark. The sound of Maria's truck fading into the night was a closing door, sealing them inside the chaos. Outside, Sheriff Brody stood silhouetted in his headlights, a useless symbol of an authority that had no power over life and death. Inside the general store, the world had shrunk to the small, makeshift bed where Lily's life was slipping away. Her violent seizure had passed, leaving her terrifyingly still. She was limp, her skin clammy, and tinged with a grayish pallor. Her breathing was a series of shallow, almost imperceptible puffs of air. Michael, falling back on the battlefield, first aid that had been drilled into him, knelt beside her. He checked her airway and gently tilted her head back. He sent one of the other women for cool water and a clean cloth, which he used to wipe the sweat from the child's burning forehead. Every action was calm, efficient, a stark contrast to the storm of grief and helplessness raging around him. Eleanor was inconsolable, her hands fluttering over her granddaughter's still form, whispering her name over and over. The other families huddled in the doorway, their earlier panic replaced by a somber, horrified silence. They were watching a child die. The scene's raw, unfiltered tragedy seemed to finally pierce Sheriff Brody's thick hide of self-interest. He had walked into the store, drawn by the commotion, and now stood awkwardly near the entrance. He had come here for a strategic victory, to break their spirits with a clever lie. Instead, he was a witness to this. He saw the child, small and still, looking so much like his own youngest granddaughter. He saw the absolute, soul-crushing despair on Eleanor's face. And he knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that Maria was long gone with the evidence box. His plan was in ruins. His career was over. His whole corrupt world had collapsed. All that was left was this small, terrible room and the dying girl who had become the center of it. A choked, ragged sound escaped his throat. I lied, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. No one looked at him. Their attention was fixed on Lily. I lied, he repeated, louder this time, his voice cracking with a mixture of guilt and defeat. I never found the kid, David. I have no idea where he is. I wanted to scare you, to make you give up. It had to 5. Michael didn't even glance up from his work, his focus entirely on Lily. But Eleanor's head snapped around, her eyes blazing with a grief so pure it was almost a physical force. Get out, she hissed. But Brody didn't move. He stared at Lily, his face a mess of conflicting emotions. The bully was gone. The corrupt official was gone. All that was left was a tired, broken man. The town doctor is 2 days away, one of the women whispered, her voice full of despair. She'll never make it. I have denied. That seemed to snap something in Brody. He took a hesitant step forward. There's another way, he said, his voice rough. Maybe. It's not a doctor, not a white doctor anyway. He had everyone's attention now. There's a reservation, the Blackfoot Settlement, about 30 miles north of here, through the mountains, he explained, speaking quickly. There's an old medicine man there, Joseph Whitehorse. The ranchers, they say he's saved people that the doctors in Bozeman gave up on. He knows the old ways. 30 miles through the mountains? At night? That would take all day, a man from the crowd exclaimed. Not if you know the Custer Trail, Brody countered, a flicker of his old authority returning. But this time, it was rooted in knowledge, not power. It's an old game trail, dangerous, washed out in places, but it cuts straight through the pass. You could make it in 6, maybe 7 hours, if you push hard. It is Leif. A desperate, impossible hope began to dawn on Eleanor's face. She looked from Brody to Michael. Michael didn't need to weigh the options. There was only one. He stood up. How do we carry her? His question was not if they should go, but how. The decision was already made. We can make a travois, Michael continued, his mind already working on the logistics. Use blankets and a couple of strong poles. We can tie it between my horse, if I can find him. Riding hand. Id is courted. Your horse won't make it on that trail, Brody said gruffly. Too narrow, too steep in places. You need a man on foot in front and a man on foot in back. You have to carry her. It was a death sentence for the plan. The journey would be too long, too arduous. But then, Brody did something no one expected. He looked at his own shaking hands, then at the dying child, and seemed to arrive at a decision that would change the course of his life. "I'll lead the way," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I know that trail like the back of my hand, and I'm strong enough to take a corner of the stretcher." He looked directly at Michael, a silent question in his eyes. It was not an order, but an offer, an act of penance. Michael stared at the man who, not an hour ago, had been his enemy. He saw no deception in Brody's eyes now, only a desperate, surprising sincerity. He didn't have time for forgiveness or judgment. He only had time for the mission. "Get the poles," Michael said to the other men, "and the strongest blankets you can find." He turned to Eleanor. "She will need to be kept warm." An unlikely alliance was forged in the face of death. A disgraced sheriff and a reclusive veteran, bound by a shared, desperate goal. The race against death had begun. The journey began under a cold, star-dusted sky. They fashioned a travois from 2 long pine poles and several layers of thick wool blankets, creating a secure litter for Lily's frail body. Michael and Brody took the front and back, the weight of the poles digging into their shoulders. Eleanor walked alongside, her hand never leaving the edge of the blankets, her voice a constant, soft murmur of encouragement to her unconscious granddaughter. Rocky ranged ahead, a silent gray shadow scouting the treacherous path. The Custer Trail was less a path and more a suggestion of one. It wound its way up the mountain, a narrow ledge of shale and rock that was barely wide enough for a single person. This was where the unlikely alliance proved its worth. Brody's knowledge was their map. He knew every twist, every patch of loose rock, every place where the trail threatened to crumble into the darkness below. "Easy on the left here, there's a washout ahead," he'd grunt, his breath misting in the frigid air. Michael's body was their engine. His time in the Marines had conditioned him for grueling treks in unforgiving terrain. He set a steady, relentless pace, his strength seemingly inexhaustible. He showed Brody how to brace his feet on the steep inclines and how to use his momentum on the descents to conserve energy. They moved as a single, determined unit, their shared mission erasing the animosity that had once existed between them. Rocky was their vanguard, his keen senses alerting them to a dislodged rock before it fell, his low growl warning of a startled deer darting across the path ahead. Hours bled into a painful, timeless blur of burning muscles and ragged breaths. They stopped only for brief moments to allow Eleanor to give Lily sips of water. The child remained limp and unresponsive, her life a fragile thread in their hands. Just as the first hint of dawn began to soften the eastern sky, they crested the final ridge. Below them, nestled in a valley protected by ancient pines, was the Blackfoot settlement. A collection of modest wooden homes and lodges, with thin tendrils of smoke rising from their chimneys into the crisp morning air. Exhausted, filthy, and running on sheer will, they stumbled down the final slope and into the quiet village. They were met not with suspicion, but with a calm, knowing acceptance. Brody, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, asked for Joseph Whitehorse. An elderly woman led them to a small, neat lodge set apart from the others. The medicine man emerged as they approached. Joseph Whitehorse was an old man, his face a beautiful, intricate map of deep lines and wrinkles. His long, silver hair was tied back with a simple leather cord. His eyes, dark and profound, seemed to look past their desperate exteriors and directly into their souls. He radiated a sense of peace that was as vast as the mountains around them. He simply looked at Lily, then gestured for them to bring her inside. The interior of the lodge smelled of sage, cedar, and damp earth. Joseph worked with a quiet, focused intensity. There were no modern instruments, only his gentle, gnarled hands, and an array of herbs and roots he prepared into teas and poultices. He chanted softly, the words ancient and rhythmic, a song of healing that seemed to fill the small space with a palpable energy. For Michael, a man of tactics and tangible results, it was a world beyond his understanding, but he recognized the absolute certainty and skill in the old man's actions. He could only trust. While they kept their vigil, the wheels of a different kind of justice were turning back in the valley. Maria had driven through the night, the metal box, a heavy weight on the seat beside her. She arrived in Helena just after sunrise and went straight to the office of Federal Investigator Williams. Williams was a thin, sharp man with tired eyes that missed nothing. He had been building a case against Clearwater Valley Bank for months, but he lacked the internal proof to make it stick. When Maria opened the box and laid out David's ledger and the forged contracts, Williams's tired eyes lit up with a cold, triumphant fire. This was the key, the undeniable proof. By midday, a convoy of dark federal vehicles was speeding towards Blackwood Creek. They arrived to find the remaining members of Brody's crew trying to intimidate the families. The arrests were swift and decisive. Armed with the ledger, Williams then went to the bank president's sprawling ranch and arrested him as he was enjoying his lunch. The corrupt empire, built on the grief of hard-working people, had crumbled to dust. Back at the reservation, 3 days passed in a haze of anxiety and hope. Joseph Whitehorse worked tirelessly. Eleanor never left her granddaughter's side. Michael and Brody found themselves in a strange limbo, their shared journey having forged an unspoken bond. Rocky was a constant, comforting presence, often lying at the foot of Lily's bed as if standing guard over her spirit. On the morning of the 4th day, Lily's eyes fluttered open. She looked around the strange room, her gaze finally settling on her grandmother. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice weak but clear, "I'm thirsty." Tears of overwhelming relief streamed down Eleanor's face. The fever had broken. The storm had passed. Later that day, one of the ranchers who had been part of their group rode up to the reservation with news of the arrests. He told them everything, that justice had been served, that they were all free. That evening, as Michael sat outside the lodge, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of fire, Brody came and sat beside him. The sheriff looked older, his face heavy with the weight of his actions. "I'm glad she's safe," Brody said quietly. He was quiet for a long time before he spoke again. "When we get back, I'm turning myself in. I'll tell them everything I did, everything I knew. I'm done running." Ismael. It was not an apology addressed to Michael, but a statement of fact, a promise to himself. The journey of atonement had reached its destination. He couldn't erase the man he had been, but he could finally choose the man he was going to be. 6 months passed, and with them, the seasons changed. The harsh Montana winter had come and gone, and a vibrant summer now breathed life into the valley. The ghost town of Blackwood Creek was a ghost no more. The silence was gone, replaced by the rhythmic sound of hammers, the distant lowing of cattle, and the bright, clear sound of children's laughter. The skeletal buildings had been given new skin, their weathered wood repaired, and their hollow windows fitted with glass that shone in the sun. Small gardens, bursting with vegetables, grew in neat plots where weeds had once reigned. On a newly carved wooden sign at the entrance to the main street, a new name was painted in bold, hopeful letters: Hope's Landing. The heart of this new life could be found in the center of town, where a healthy, vibrant Lily, her face full of sunshine and mischief, was throwing a worn tennis ball. Her laughter pealed through the air as a magnificent gray and white German shepherd leaped to catch it, his movements a symphony of grace and power. Rocky, the hero of Hope's Landing, was no longer just Michael's dog. He belonged to the entire community, a beloved symbol of their resilience. He adored the attention, especially from Lily, whose life was so deeply intertwined with his own. He would bring the ball back, drop it at her feet, and nudge her hand with his nose, his amber eyes full of happy devotion. Michael watched the scene from the porch of the general store, a mug of coffee warming his hands. The store was now a proper business, run by Eleanor, its shelves stocked with goods that served the small but growing community. A quiet smile touched Michael's lips, a gesture that was no longer foreign to his face. The deep, weary lines of the man who had arrived seeking only an escape had softened. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a calm, steady peace. A dusty farm truck rumbled to a stop in front of the store. A man in simple work clothes got out and began unloading sacks of feed. It was Brody. He had served a reduced sentence, thanks to his full confession and his role in saving Lily's life. He was thinner now, humbled, the arrogance and cruelty stripped away, leaving behind a quiet, reserved man. He worked at Maria's ranch, his way of silently repaying his debt to the community he had once wronged. He met Michael's gaze and gave a short, respectful nod, which Michael returned. There was no animosity, only the quiet understanding of a shared, life-altering journey. Michael no longer felt like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own past. He had a purpose here. He was the town's anchor, the quiet leader they looked to, the protector who had taught them how to stand and fight. He had come here to bury his memories, to find peace in emptiness. Instead, he had found it in connection, in the shared work of building something new from the ashes of something old. He had found it in the simple, everyday moments, sharing a morning coffee with Eleanor, watching Lily grow stronger every day, feeling Rocky's steady presence at his side. He had found a family. As evening approached, the work of the day wound down. The sun began its descent, setting the vast Montana sky ablaze with color. Lily, tired from playing, came and curled up on the porch swing next to Eleanor, who wrapped a protective arm around her. Michael sat in his usual chair, and Rocky came to rest his heavy head on his master's knee, his tail thumping a soft, contented rhythm against the wooden planks. The four of them sat in comfortable silence, a complete, unspoken unit. They watched the sun dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains. They weren't just four souls who had been thrown together by circumstance. They were a family, forged in the crucible of fear and injustice, and healed by loyalty, courage, and hope. Michael looked down at Rocky, at the dog whose instincts had led them not just to a box of papers, but to this life, this peace. The dog who had sensed life in a silent town, who had stood fearlessly against a corrupt lawman, who had led them to the truth. The dog who had shown a lost soldier the way home. He ran his hand over Rocky's head, feeling the familiar, thick fur. The silence that settled over Hope's Landing was not the empty, heavy silence of a graveyard he had once sought. It was a rich, peaceful silence, filled with the promise of a new dawn. He was home. The story of Hope's Landing teaches us that a home is not a place you find, but a place you build with courage, kindness, and the unwavering loyalty of a faithful friend. If the journey of Michael and Rocky moved you, we invite you to become part of our community by sharing their tale and subscribing to our channel. Your support allows these stories of hope to be told. Let us know in the comments what Rocky's loyalty meant to you. And please continue the journey with us by clicking on the next unforgettable story waiting for you right now on the screen.